kind of joint meeting between Bristol Radical History Group and the Eastville Workhouse Memorial Group, who we're all involved as well, which is a community group in Eastville, which has been working on raising money and raising the profile of this burial ground here on the right, which is was part of the Eastville Workhouse in the 19th and early 20th century. So we're sort of representing, I mean, there's people from Eastville Workhouse Memorial Group here. Right, so this is the plan tonight. Obviously, what we're going to try and do is kind of cover some of the themes that are in this book that Di's going to hold up, which is tonight only £6. Recommended retail price £7.50, or you can buy it online. Anyway, whatever. So we're kind of, we'll talk about. We're not obviously going to cover everything in the book because we'd be here all night, and you don't want that. You certainly don't want that. And what we're going to do is cover some of the themes in the book, and hopefully we're going to have a bit of a chat at the end, and then you're going to go and buy the book. So these are the things we're going to cover. So first of all, very quickly, we look at our sources, because one of the issues about doing research about these workhouses that came up, especially Eastville and Bristol workhouses, was the lack of evidence, because a lot of the information about them was destroyed 75 years ago, 75 years ago in a few days, I think, when a bomb hit St Peter's Hospital on Castle Park during a Luftwaffe raid, which destroyed a lot of the evidence. So that's one thing. We're going to talk about a little bit of sources. Steve's going to talk a little bit about the poor laws of the workhouse, and I'm going to help him a little bit. Yeah. And then we'll talk very quickly, look at what the poor law unions in Bristol were, and the other workhouses very briefly. Who was in the workhouse, which is interesting. And then Di's going to cover life and death in the workhouse, which is sort of the theme, some of the themes in the book. And finally, we'll look at briefly about some of the work at burial ground that we've been doing at Rosemary Green, which you might have seen on the media this week or been at, and then we'll have a chat. So that's the plan. So just first of all about sources. I'm not going to go through them all now, but the difference in primary sources and secondary. So primary sources are actually sort of kind of documents that relate directly to what happened historically. So there is quite a lot of information about the workhouse, Eastville Workhouse around at the Bristol Record Office, so I definitely recommend going down there if you haven't been already at some point, just to go and look something up. You can look on their catalogue, go down and look at the original documents. It's really exciting to actually see them. We certainly have been surprised and excited, haven't we, doing this project and some of the things we've found. We've also been tediously bored as well, going through like thousands of people in death registers. In fact, it's quite a sad process sometimes when you go through the death registers. So there's a whole load of information there, maps, the workhouse, all sorts of stuff which you can get out, and we can help you if you want to go and look at that information. I would definitely recommend doing that. There's also some very useful information in the Bristol Central Reference Library, particularly health reports and statement of accounts. There's the 1881 census, which is online, which actually gives you a snapshot of who was in the workhouse in a particular month in 1881, which we've used some of that information. There's a really great CD called the University of West England Historical Resources CD, which kind of summarises a lot of the health and economic statistics about poor law unions at Bristol. British Medical Journal reports, because they visited the workhouse, quite shocking really, continually shocking for decades. And really important now, and luckily with this sort of new world of the internet, we're able to do word searches into local newspapers from the 19th century, particularly the Bristol Mercury and the Western Daily Press, which gave us loads of information about crimes and other activities. Obviously, you have to be aware that you're looking at the newspaper, and I'm sure that if, no disrespect to the Bristol Post, but if you were trying to work out what was going on in Bristol, going back to the Bristol Post in 100 years' time, you might be a bit confused. So you have to be aware of local newspapers, but they are really interesting reports, particularly meetings of the boards of guardians. So, I mean, I think it was 1859, there was a campaign by the local newspapers to be allowed in to the boards of guardians meetings, and they resisted for a long time. Eventually they let journalists in, so after 1860 you can actually read about what they're talking about, and in some cases it's very shocking. And finally, there's a really great website by Peter Higginbotham called workhouses.org, which kind of has workhouses from all round here, Stapleton and Southmead, and you can go and look at. The secondary sources when people write about history, so our book's a secondary source, and these books are secondary sources, but there is some good information. This pamphlet, Bristol and the New Poor Law by David Large, Elizabeth Hurren's work on this crusading, we'll come on to in a minute, crusading an anti-welfare crusade. This book Norman Longmate, which is a social history of the workhouse. If you want to be crying yourself to sleep, that's the one to read. As is the Workhouse Cookbook by Peter Higginbotham as well. So quite some really interesting stuff, also quite sad stuff to read. To be honest, I'd suggest not getting into the workhouse too deeply for too long. It's a bit depressing. And finally, there's two other authors here, Moira Martin, who did a lot of work on women and how they got involved in getting elected to the boards of guardians, and a guy called Parker who deals with emigration of Bristol children to Canada. It's really good stuff. So we used a lot of these and a lot more, but they're the main ones, so you know. Right, Steve.
Okay. Greens comrades. As we always know, the poor have always been with us, or at least they've always been with us since the advent of capitalism and inequalities underneath that system. There's always been the haves and the have-nots. It wasn't really recognised as what to do with the poor until the Statute of Labourers, which came after Black Death in 1381, when large swathes of England were laid waste because of the bubonic plague, and there was actually a shortage of labour. So this signified the death knell of feudalism, and people could move about, and they could go from farm to farm saying, how much are you paying? But also at the same time, because there was a shortage of labour, the ruling classes had an eye on what they would see as vagrants, beggars, travelling musicians and such like, and people were forcibly put to work. This carried on, but also another thing, I don't know if any of you have ever read Michel Foucault and Madness and Civilization. A lot of the villages and what have you, they would look after adults with learning difficulties, they would look after the elderly, and there was a community response to people who were infirm and couldn't work or couldn't carry out a day's work. But also there's the Vagabonds and Beggars Act in 1597, and basically if you were caught begging, the first offence you were put in the stocks and had stuff thrown at you. After that you might be whipped out of town, and the last offence you could actually be hung for it if you really wouldn't pack it in. But they'd also try to bore through your tongue, which was particularly unpleasant. So you could see that what they were actually trying to do was force people into some time work discipline. There wasn't any room for people who just wanted to move about and do a bit of day labour, do a bit here, do a bit there and get on. In 1601, Elizabeth I, Lizzie the Ginger, brought in what was probably the first actual proper poor law, which was looking at what to do with people who actually couldn't work, the deserving poor, as they were called them back in those days. And this was the advent of almshouses. You know, the St Peter's Almshouse was just up there. And there's the one at the top of Christmas steps, isn't there, for the sailors. Charitable institutions raised by local money earners in the parishes, people who paid the parish rate that go into there. But also later on, they'd have outdoor relief for what was seen as the deserving poor. Now, the deserving poor was quite interesting in the respect of, it was normally paid to people who didn't have work for a particular period of time. Obviously, most people worked in rural occupations, and it was the harvest where there was a lot of work. During the winter, this time of year, there was no work. And what they would do is they would give what was known as a parish loaf, sometimes clothes, sometimes pay rent for people and their families. However, there were other sides to it as well. They also brought in what was known as a parish overseer. Now, the overseer of the poor law would keep an eye on people. If you were caught in the pub when you were getting parish relief, they would stop your money. Also, in some parishes, Bristol included, if you had a dog, they'd stop your money. That wasn't just because they thought you were blowing all your money on dog food, it's because they knew you were out at night probably poaching and having a few rabbits away from the same people who were paying your parish relief. I've explained a bit about outdoor and indoor relief. Introduction to the workhouse, that came about obviously with the almshouse. It became more and more stringent. They were putting people into these almshouses. They were sometimes making them work. The parish was saying, this is starting to cost too much money. Where's this money coming from? We're the people who are paying for these poor people. We need something back. But obviously a lot of the people that were still in these almshouses, early workhouses, were too infirm to work. And they were given silly little tasks like you've heard about picking oakum and such, like unpicking ropes they could use again, stuff like that. I mean, that went right on until very later on. The Spielhandlands scheme come in 1795. That is a very important piece of legislation. 1795, right in the middle of the French Revolution, of course. Remember what Marie Antoinette said? Let her eat cake. It didn't go down well, did it? So what they did over here is they looked after the poor to an extent. And what they did is they linked the poor relief rate into the price of bread, because obviously there was massive fluctuations. So if there was a bad harvest and the price of bread went up, the family could starve. So they linked it in with the size of your family and the price of bread. But there was another side to this as well. Some cunning farmers worked out that if they kept the wages low, the parish, everybody who paid into the parish relief, would make up the difference. So the farmers who kept, it was largely farmers, but also some industrialists, kept the money down to subsistence or barely subsistence level, and the parish had to make it up. And also, they'd work people really hard for short periods of time, and then lay them off. So, we also have in 1831, as I'm sure you know about, if you don't, there's a very good pamphlet over there written by my comrade here, about the swing rights, agricultural rights in 1831. Mainly about the introduction of machinery into agriculture, but there was a lot of other stuff. It was not a happy place in the English countryside at the time. And there were major riots starting in Kent, Surrey, Sussex, Wessex, all over the place. Not so much up north, mainly in the south, but these riots were very, very important in the respect of, there was another revolution in France, obviously in 1830, and people were very, very concerned about the social fabric. It was on the point of ripping. The people in power felt that the working class were getting a little bit uppity, they were getting a little bit above their station. You know, and also, we're paying these people. We're paying them the parish relief. The parish relief is coming out of our back pockets. It's costing us a lot of money. And then they're giving it large about the threshing machines. You know, there was all that feeling as well. And they brought in a Royal Commission, a study in 1832, around the poor law, around what was the provision, who was getting it, why they were getting it, how it was being distributed, and also, importantly, who they felt the poor were. Were they deserving? And out of that came the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act. And as it said there, it led to the phasing out of outdoor relief, the introduction of major workhouses. Not all parishes had workhouses, but what it also brought in, that parishes could combine together to build a big workhouse, and that's what happened at Eastville. The actual workhouse, the parish, people who mainly paid for it, came from Clifton. They didn't want people dying on their doorstep because it had pushed up the death rates for the spa. You know, it wouldn't look very good to the tourist industry, so they brought it down to, called it Barton Regis and stuck it in Eastville. That's another story, I'm sure. I hope I'm not stealing someone's thunder here. But they built these massive workhouses, and basically what they were looking to do was to punish people for being poor for all intents and purposes. But also it was to serve a warning. That was the last place you went. I mean, when we were handing out leaflets, when we first started this whole project, we were up at East Park, the estate where the old workhouse was. We were handing out leaflets, and some people come up to us and go, oh, my nan used to say to me that her mum used to say, if you don't eat your sprouts, I'm going to send you to the workhouse. It was like a local bogeyman. People were terrified of going in there, and for very good reason. Once you went in there, it was very unlikely you were going to come out again, especially in the same state of affairs you went in. There were stories about children going in there and losing a third of their body weight. To get out, you'd have to basically have a job and be able to exist, to sustain your family again, because you'd go in there and your family would be split up. There was also reasons they'd split up your family as well. They didn't want the poor breeding. There's a very nice man called Malthus Undertones, the poor producing the poor. He had this philosophy, and once again it was about 1795, just after the Spielhagen Lamb system, that the poor were going to outgrow subsistence. We would never be able to keep up with the amount of poor that are breeding in the inner cities and need to be fed. And we're just feeding them, and we're producing more of a problem. I'm not saying this is his theory, I don't agree with it at all. And we know it's wrong now, don't we? But at the end of the day, he felt that the poor were going to outgrow the amount of bread we could actually grow as a nation, and therefore it would drag the whole social fabric down. I said about the fear of the workhouses. Families were split up. Families were put to hard labour. There's a very good picture in our book of a tramp in a day cell. And basically what they had to do is they got put in this day cell. They had to break up a rock. I think it was 300 pounds, wasn't it? Something like that. It was a pretty large rock. They had to smash it up. And there was a grate which went out into the outer courtyard. And they had to fit the stones they'd broken up through this grate in 3 hours' time. That was used as aggregate for the roads. But also if they broke up in 3 hours, they were moved on, and they could they get a little loaf and a cup of gruel basically and sent on their way. Do you want to do the next bit? For some people, even this draconian system of, because the workhouse also sometimes, it was also used to house petty offenders and orphans, people like that. So it was a definite punishment philosophy behind it. But for some people, it was still too nice and pretty in there. And there's a really good cartoon, once again, in the book. I know I keep going about the book, but it is well sourced, of all these inmates that are having a party and everything. They've got these posters up on the wall going, "Isn't life wonderful here?" And there's some middle-class person looking down their nose thinking, "I'm paying for this," you know. So it was this crusade in 1870 of powerful lobbyists, senior politicians. They were there, they were trying their hardest to make it as harder and cut costs even more. There was pressure put on the guardians to reduce costs, reduce the diet, get more money in by making the work more productive, if you like. Yeah? And the local government board organisation produced commissioners, and they were saying the body of guardians are basically being fooled by these people. They're too close to the locality, and the commissioners would go around and carry out inspections, go for the books with a fine-tooth comb and say, you know, you're giving these people a cup of tea on a Sunday, are you mad? You know, they don't deserve that, they're poor, you know, just give them water, stuff like that. And separating deserving and undeserving poor, once again, that was there to punish people for being poor. It was like, "Oi, you, stop being poor," as it was all there for. And obviously, at the bottom here, attack on outdoor relief. Any of the parishes still hadn't had workhouses, and there still were a few, you know, dotted about that didn't like the thought of workhouses, and we're trying to keep families together for a short period of time. Because this is it, as I said, you know, a lot of people were out of work for a short period of time, but if they went into the workhouse, they would lose their chance to get back into the labour market. So it was counterproductive. I mean, that is evident for us sitting here now. But for some of these people, it wasn't. But some of the people who didn't have workhouses understood this. But the commissioners were going around and going, "Where's your workhouse? Bang your poor up." And obviously, there was a long depression from 1873 to 1896. Lots of failures of the harvest, wars, and of course the dearth that follows. The working class get it worse. One last thing I'd like to point out before I pass this over to Rog is the liberal reforms, the great liberal reforms of 1906 that was started, the precursor to the proper welfare state, in my view, only came around after the Boer War, when they tried to, all the people they got to fight for them, you know, 2/3 of the working class were not fit to fight in the front line because of malnourishment, rickets and other treatable diseases. And they realised that the empire couldn't be fought, or they couldn't even slaughter us properly in the foreign fields because we weren't fed and weren't housed and weren't looked after properly. And that's the precursor to 1906 liberal reforms, in my view. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Roger. Thank you very much. Is that cool?
Okay, you want me to?
Oh, sorry, Di.
It's all right. It's all right. So this is a map of the area of the workhouse. What's very difficult is the names. Quite often, the workhouse that is our book's about was initially called the Clifton Union. It was an amalgamation of a number of workhouses that were in Clifton, and you can see on the map the area of the Clifton Poor Law Union was a big kind of a horseshoe around the centre of Bristol. Because in the centre of Bristol, you had a very ancient organisation called the Bristol Corporation of the Poor, which had the workhouse at St Peter's Hospital, which has already been mentioned. And then in the south, you had what is it in now? In Somerset, you had the Bedminster Poor Law Union, which ended up in having a workhouse in Flaxbourton. So it's a very peculiar kind of thing. Why is it called the Clifton Union, whereas actually the actual workhouse is where the number 3 is, I think, on that map.
Number 5.
Oh, number 5 is on the map, which is nowhere near Clifton. And as Steve has already said, that the inhabitants of Bristol, which was at that time kind of a wealthy spa kind of place, didn't want the publicity of deaths from notifiable diseases and cholera and so on, putting people off coming to the spa. So they campaigned to change the name of the union, which is the organisation for the workhouse. So they changed it to Barton Regis, but the actual workhouse itself has always been known as the Eastville Workhouse. You've got these 3 confusing names. Anyway, that's where they're all form. So this is the actual workhouse. This is a 1967 picture. And because it still existed as an institution, by that time being an old people's home, until the 1970s. And the graveyard, if I'm right, is right at the bottom right-hand corner. That's Robertson Road along the bottom.
We believe that's right, isn't it?
Can you say what the main name
That's
of the
Fish-
main road?
That's
That's
Fishponds Road.
Robertson Road,
Fishponds
Emily
Road.
Road up there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and
Is that ground all, you know, the burial ground, has that always been on that steep slope?
well, it wasn't quite
Yeah.
as steep.
Yeah.
It's always been steepish because they certainly talked about how it was a very
Right.
not a very useful place to bury people on the steep
I see.
slope.
Okay.
Okay, so that's what it looked like. And I think this is the next slide, the plan. Yes, the plan shows this very clearly. It shows things about how what-
That must be Stapleton Road, not Fishponds.
No, it's Fishponds Road. It's just
It
when you get to
becomes Stapleton Road.
It actually starts at the end. Stapleton Road finishes sort of
The Stapleton
by the Black
flicks off, just by the job centre.
That's right, it goes off on the left.
yeah. So Stapleton Road goes down here.
There.
Yeah, yeah.
The actual address was 100 Fishponds Road.
So you can still see at that point, 100 Fishponds Road, we've got pictures in the book, there is the only remnants of the workhouse is the wall, which is the wall along where it says the workhouse entrance, and it still has a sign saying 100 Fishponds Road, and that was the place that was the bogeyman. It became the name of it, was known as 100 Fishponds Road, but it was the workhouse. So I want to talk a bit, I'm going to be talking about the daily life in the workhouse, and I want to use this this chart to really indicate what would happen. Is what would happen to people who were going to go into the workhouse. They would arrive at their workhouse entrance, and they'd have to walk up this huge long path right up to what it's the first bit of the building is the male and female receiving wards, and you go in through this big gate, and the porter would remove all your presumably they had gender specific porters, but anyway they would remove you would have to be undressed and put into the workhouse uniform, and then you'd be separated into the different categories, and the different categories, the main categories for adults would be whether you were able-bodied or not able-bodied, and then you'd be divided by gender. It's very helpful. It's divided by gender along the middle spine of the building, but you've got all these different categories. You haven't just got men and women. You've got able-bodied women, and then you've got insane women, and then you've got lunatics, and then you've got imbeciles, and then you've got aged persons. So everybody was really utterly divided up. So you might go in with a number of your members of your family, but you will be divided up and put into different categories. And children will be separated from their parents, and children were to be separated from their mothers after the age of 1, though they could still sleep in the bed with their mother up to the age of 2, but orphan children would be sleeping in the dormitories. So there was this complete division, and we're going to come on later to talk about what the work and what people were doing in their days once they got in there. So there's another picture. See how oppressive it is. Argyle Street, you can locate it from Argyle Street. That's still there, isn't it? Argyle Street, off Fishponds Road. So then, when it was demolished in 1972, which is an important part of our story, because this is looking from the back of the workhouse, and this is probably taken from a point on the cemetery, wouldn't you say, Roger?
I've not been able to locate exactly where this is, but
No.
that chimney there is a laundry that was knocked down after that.
So just to skip ahead a little bit, what happened when they demolished the workhouse in 1972? These are the entrance gates that I was mentioning before. When they demolished the workhouse in 1972, they merely demolished the buildings, but they didn't but then you've still got this area of the cemetery. And they were supposed to be only demolishing the buildings and not going into the area of the cemetery. And when we began doing our research, we were always saying, well, where are the bodies still there? Because we knew that people had been buried there, but we didn't know if they were still there. And quite late on, about 3 or 4 months ago, when we'd done some public event, somebody came forward and said that he had been involved with a demolition firm, and Roger got to speak to the director of this demolition firm, who had done that demolition at the end of the 1960s. And in doing the demolition, they came across bones. And they took the bones and put them all in large crates and removed them, and they were re-interned in Avonview Cemetery. I know I'm jumping off from everyday life, but I'll leave that there. Because that's what that
Seems
picture
odd,
shows.
doesn't it, that they didn't use Greenbank, which is adjacent.
Well, Greenbank Cemetery was only opened in the 1870s.
No, she talked about 1972.
Oh,
Oh, talking about why they
Yeah.
didn't put them in Greenbank. Oh, okay. I don't know the reason. We're still trying to talk to both the dioceses of Gloucester and Bristol to try and find out their records. I know that Bristol haven't got any records at all, apparently, but we're not sure. We're still in the middle of researching that.
We had a half-decent email on Monday from Bishop.
But I'm just going to butt in here and do a little bit of demographics, and then Di will talk about everyday life in the working class.
More detail.
So what this is like, this is just a graph which was what we did was we wanted to look at how many people were actually in the workhouse to start with, to kind of get an idea about who they were. And so what this is a graph of, if you look at the statistics, you get these half-yearly figures, so you can kind of work out kind of on average how many people were going through the workhouse. Obviously it changed in the winter, there might be more, but this is a trend, and it goes from 1857, the bottom left-hand corner, up to 1898. So kind of the period of when our graveyard was in operation. These are the kind of numbers. So you can see there's a couple of expansions of the workhouse. It started off with a capacity around 800, went up to about 1,200 in 1858. They added on other things like lunatic wards and fever hospitals and infirmary as well. That looks all good, doesn't it? But actually some of these things were financial scams to save money, and I'll come on to that later on. But what's interesting about this is, first of all, there's an increasing trend of numbers of people going into the workhouse. That line is a kind of trend line. So the number of people in Eastville Workhouse is increasing through the century. Now you might think, well, maybe that's a bit odd, because you might think things were getting better as time went on. That's not necessarily true. And you might say, well, that's just the growth of population. Well, I've compared the growth of Bristol's population against this, and this is growing faster than the growth of population. So that's suggesting more people are ending up in the workhouse as the century goes on. The other thing that's really interesting is these little things along the bottom here. So what I've done is I've plotted in a few. So you can see 1857 to 1858, there was this these are financial crises, economic recessions. So there's one there, the Panic of 1857, the Cotton Famine of 1862 to 64. That's when the American Civil War's on. And cotton supplies are being affected by the American Civil War. The British kind of supported the South because they wanted the cotton. But there was a problem getting cotton at that stage, and that meant that 1,500 cotton workers in East Bristol were laid off for quite a long time. So you can see there, interestingly, there's a little peak appearing. So each time there's one of these recessions, you can see more people entering the workhouse. Not really surprising, but it kind of proves that there wasn't this kind of not a correlation between them. It was something to do with just, scroungers or something. Similarly, you can see a recession of 1867 to 69. There's another hump there. And then this long depression that Steve mentioned, which is the longest, is still, I think, the longest recession in British economic history. Occurred between 1873 and 1896. And it's important because it was actually called the Great Depression until the 30s, to the 1930s, and maybe the one we're having now it's been going on for a while, hasn't it? So maybe it'll break the record, maybe not, I don't know. But all of these things cause fluctuations, and certainly more people going into the workhouse. I can tell you in Bristol in 1879 was a particularly bad year. And you've got to remember, people are desperately trying not to go into the workhouse. That's the point. I mean, everyone's not only frightened of it, but it's meant to be a harsher regime than the worst poverty on the outside. That's what they were trying to make it. But I can tell you in 1879, you can see there's quite a big peak there, isn't there? That's because a large number of agricultural workers, dockers, were actually freezing and starving to death in Bristol. Even the Guardians were shocked, which was telling you something. The other Guardians said that it was exaggerated and they were spending their money on alcohol. You know, we've heard all that before. So that period in there was particularly bad. So it gives you an idea of the fluctuations. The next thing is like to try. We had a little look at the 1881 census, which is quite a good time to look because it's sort of in the middle of this depression, and it gives you an idea of the kind of people or some of the ideas about who was in there and what ages. So we've got at the top left here, you can see that what's interesting is that there's a lot of young people in there, a lot of children. So you've got like, 10% of the people in there were infants under 7 years old, another 20% were basically children under the age of 14. And also you've got a lot of old people over 65, like nearly a quarter of the people in there are over 65. So it's interesting if you're going after these scroungers, so there's these old people who are all scroungers, and you've got all these infants and children that are scroungers. So something interesting here that, maybe it's not really going after the able-bodied scrounger, this institution. And down here on the right, even more interesting is that the amount of married people. So there's a large amount of unmarried people here. Now I actually took the age, I think from 16 or something, because in those days you could get married at 14. There wasn't really any rules about it. But what's interesting is the marriage rates were falling through the Victorian period, which maybe is not what we might expect, but marriage rate was falling relative to the growth of the population. So there's a lot of unmarried people that, you can imagine being very poor is probably not easy to get married or to even get settled. So that might be one of the reasons.
A lot of jobs, you lose your job if you got married.
Yeah. Well, that's
if you're in domestic.
So you needed to both work, yeah.
Or you're not allowed to be married if you're in certain jobs like domestic service.
Well, that's right, yeah. Well, that's interesting because that really is reflected in the next slide here, which top left is who was in there and where did they come from. So again, this is this snapshot in 1881, but what you see is that the vast majority, 2/3 of the people have come from the Bristol area, Somerset and Gloucestershire. That's their home parishes. But you've also got another group from around England, some we don't know about. A lot of them were people who were quoted as lunatics, imbeciles or idiots. They were not given, they didn't have any place they were known to come from. A lot of deserted children, it wasn't clear. But there's also significant numbers of Irish, Welsh and some Scottish people in there as well. So but it's pretty much a West Country institution. It's people from this area, local area, which is not really a surprise. More interesting is what kind of occupations they had. So you take out the children under 15s, they haven't got occupations. Well, some of them did, but they were working in cotton factories, but we'll come on to that in a minute. But the main group, the biggest group of occupations is domestic service. And as you said, the domestic servants were particularly vulnerable for two reasons, I would argue. When you went into work, if you were in the house and you were living in the house, you were acting as a servant, so you were given, quarters and food. But of course, that was precarious because if you became pregnant, for example, that could mean you were pushed out of service, or secondly, if you became old or sick or infirm, you could also be pushed out. So there's a large group of people who clearly have either older domestic servants or people who become pregnant or sick who've ended up in the workhouse. You're homeless, basically. Off you go, see you later, released from service. The other big group is manufacture, so it's people who in all sorts of occupations. You could look up all the occupations, we've got them in tables in there. Interestingly, the agricultural group is quite small by this period, because earlier in the century it would have been a much larger group of people who have been in the workhouse from agriculture. I mean, for example, you might look at something like the Tolpuddle Martyrs, as a group, when they were, the Tolpuddle Martyrs were sent off for joining a trade union to transport to Australia. When they came back, most of them had to leave the country. I think 5 of them left, ended up in Canada. Assisted emigration, it was called. And one that was left ended up, George Lovelace, I think, died in a workhouse in Dorchester. So there was a lot of agricultural people who went into work. But by this stage, 1880s, they're all displaced or to the colonies, or they've had to become factory workers, or so it's quite a small group. Now, we get some bit more detail in the book about that. Right, I'm about to die.
Okay, I began with saying that you would be admitted, I've said, and put in those different kind of categories. The working day, this workhouse is not a misnomer. The working day was incredibly long. They were working for 9 to 10 hours a day, for 6 days a week, with only 2 days holiday in the whole year. A large number of people would be working in domestic service, and this would be particularly women, in the workhouse. They would be the laundresses, they would be the cooks. They'd also have a lot of in-house people who would be doing the men, probably, doing the carpentry and the gardening and maintaining the fabric of the building. But then the stone breaking, which Steve has already described, and the oakum picking, which is a horrifically horrible task, which both men and women did. And they would be doing this all on an incredibly impoverished diet. We've got, I hope I can find it, we've got some information about how much they had to eat on an average every day, and they had a particular diet sheet that they had to follow. So they would be having 3 pints of gruel a day, which is a kind of watery soup, and then they would be having, I can't find the page number. They would have different things at lunchtimes. They would have a pea soup some lunchtimes, and other times that they would have meat. And it was an incredibly limited kind of diet. It provided about 75% of the calories that you would expect for a person to be able to maintain their body weight. And these were people who were working on this incredibly hard physical labour, and also the workhouse was incredibly badly heated. They had a whole big debate about they were spending too much on coal. They spent much more on coal, apparently, than the Bristol Corporation of the Poor. So they suggested what they needed to do is, you know those little Victorian fireplaces which you might have gone to your granny's, you had to huddle really near them to keep warm? Well, there'd be a fireplace like that in a room about this size, but they decided to try to make them smaller so they would use less coal. So at every turn they were trying to find ways to penny pinch. Steve has mentioned about the tramps and the stone cells, and they were kept entirely separate from the rest of the people in the workhouse. And here we have a very good photograph of that. I think the top one there, picking oakum.
The top one's a stone breaking. Yeah.
Oh, it's a stone breaking up. Yes, so they would be breaking stone in a yard that seems to be indoors. And this is where they're having to break the stone, as Steve said, to that tiny size to put it through the grill. And that's one of the cells, they call them cells, that the tramps would live in. If you've ever read George Orwell's Down and Out in London and Paris, his account of in the early part of the 20th century of going to spikes, is very much what it was like to be a tramp. And you could get a ticket. You would get a ticket to your next destination. So you'd say, for example, you were wanting to go to Gloucester, and you had then to get to Gloucester by the following night, and you would then be admitted to the next one. And you weren't allowed to be wandering abroad, or what Steve was talking about, people who are beggars or on the road and weren't en route to the new workhouse. They could well be arrested and imprisoned.
And it wasn't just men, it wasn't just men.
Okay.
We found at Eastville like cells that were built for men and women tramps, but also women with children. And so they actually upgraded them in 1905. So there was women and children on the road, certainly right into the 20th century, which is quite interesting, quite shocking actually.
Yeah.
Do we go back to that?
Yeah. Right, so I wanted now to also talk about the treatment of children. I'd already explained how children were separated from their parents, and they might be allowed to see their parents, have a visitation from their parents about once a day, but they were otherwise kept entirely separate. And they didn't always keep children in the workhouse, in those wards that are shown on the map. They would also board children out, so kind of like a fostering, and they would pay a certain rate to people to have the children boarded out with them. Sometimes that would be better than being in the workhouse. But do you think of all the stuff that comes to light now about the treatment of children in children's homes and paedophilia and so on? I mean, imagine a lot of times those children, both the children that were in the actual institution and those that were boarded out, would be subject to all sorts of kinds of abuse. And and of course they tried to get children over the age of 14 into work. They had to talk about trying to get some good boys to go and work in the South Wales coalfield, and they also had emigrated children to Canada, and they had whole schemes of sending children to Canada. It reminded me very much of the stuff, the big scandal about children being sent to Australia and being cut off from their... Yes. Yes, yeah.
They were Aboriginal children, but it was the stolen children.
Stolen. Yes. So the children were likewise stolen because they were supposed not to emigrate children if they had family, but they also they would say things like they would think they were entitled to remove children from their parents if the parents were going to be a bad influence. So if the parents drank or were in prison or stuff, then they would think it was perfect within their rights to send their children off to Canada.
I think it's also important to say that they purposefully made sure that their parents would never find them again as well. So not only did they take them, it was made such that the parents wouldn't find those children again. And then I can tell you from Eastville Workhouse, they lost them in Canada anyway. So most of the children, I think 1,200 children emigrated from Bristol, and most of them were lost in Canada. So they stopped the parents finding out, and at the same time they were so disorganised, their organisation, their immigration organisation, they actually lost them at the other end as well. So that's why there's a lot of Canadian people trying to find out where they come from.
Not only was the workhouse this institution which might seem like a punishment itself. If one in the workhouse, if people did things that they were against the rules of the workhouse, they would then be further punished. And there's a very good example from the local paper from 1867 about what happened to 3 girls. The master complained that 3 girls had torn a couple of leaves out of a book which was for the use of inmates of the ward to which they belonged. The Reverend Burgess suggested the girls should be taken before the magistrates, but a guardian proposed the girls should be brought before the guardian's board and they might admit the charges. The 3 girls were a few minutes afterwards introduced to the guardians. The chairman: "Which of you girls broke out the leaves of the book?" First girl: "We all 3 did it." The chairman: "Do you 2 others admit you had a share in it?" Second girl: "Yes, sir." And the third girl: "What does the third girl say? Did you do it too?" "Yes, sir." "What did you do it for?" "No matter what they did it for. I move they be sent before the magistrates and prosecuted for destroying the property of the Union." And the Reverend Burgess chimes in: "I hope they will have a very severe punishment." The resolution was put and carried unanimously. So they would be sent to prison for doing things like, or stealing a scarf.
They were 12
Yeah.
years old.
Or another person broke off branches of was found in the street having broken off branches of lilac, which were growing apparently in the cemetery, and he was sent to prison. And people would be in prison for absolutely minor offences. But then for some people, one woman who was before the court said she would rather go to prison than be in the workhouse because you were fed better in the prison and you didn't have to work. So it was a very punitive environment.
What is oakum?
Oakum is it's a tar-covered rope, which is actually used in the caulking of ships. You know, between the planks in a ship, you have to put rope in
They mix it
between.
with tar.
Yeah, and so it's mixed with tar, but then it's not usable again unless you pick the tar off the rope. So it's
You'd
really,
actually unpick the rope, wouldn't you? Maybe
Yeah.
use strands of rope. that
Yeah.
could be
But you can
used.
make rough textiles with
Yeah.
sacks, once you attach that kind of stuff as well.
yeah.
Yeah, so they pick I think it's where the expression "money for old rope" comes from.
Yeah.
So you
It's
put
useless.
Split all the ends of your fingers,
Yes.
fingernails, and ruined your hands.
Mm,
Rest of your life.
really horrible.
I think it was, they took the rope to bits and then they used it to block the planks between it and the
Yeah.
ship.
Okay.
Or rough weaving, depending
Yeah.
on what the
Right, in the tradition of history from below, which is what we do in Bristol Radical History, we like to look and see where there was resistance to things, and there was resistance around the workhouse. Steve has written a really good section in the book which you can look into, which is about what happened when the poor laws were actually brought in 1834. So there was, I talk about externalism, I'm saying outside the workhouse, there was a lot of resistance, not only to the poor laws, but also to the workhouses. And there's too much to talk about here, but I can tell you they sent the military in, there were riots, attempts to, in many areas of northern England, or some areas of northern England, certainly in Wales, they weren't actually able to build workhouses for decades because of the resistance. So boards of guardians would try and meet and try and organise for the poor law unions. They'd be attacked by crowds or driven out of town, certainly in the Lancashire and Weaving districts as well in particular. And those protests of the 1830s went on to become part of Chartist politics of the 1840s. So, if you want to read scathing attacks on the workhouse, they come from Chartists in particular. It was central to the Chartist programme as well. But if we go to Bristol, Bristol's generally seen as being kind of quite benign. There wasn't much opposition here. Well, that's not strictly true. There were protest meetings we found going on right the way through into the 1880s about the workhouse. So there's definitely evidence on the outside that people weren't happy about it. And there was also a whole period where, as the radical press grew in the late 19th century, papers like the Clarion are really interesting because what they do is they try and interview people who actually work in workhouses to get the information. They run a whole series of kind of investigative journalism. It's early investigative journalism. So there's a lot of attacks coming from kind of stories that are coming, whistleblowers out of the workhouse talking about the conditions, and a whole load of articles which come out. And also you get infiltrators. So you get, particularly around the turn of the century, 1900, there's famous women who actually put themselves into the workhouse, like go in as, there was one famous domestic servant who did it. And then they write and tell you what it was like. And those accounts, I've got to say, if anybody thinks that breaking rocks is harder than doing domestic labour, you need to read some of these accounts of these women. Domestic labour was extremely hard. And they talk a lot about that in these accounts. So there's kind of a whistle blowing on, there's a kind of investigative journalism, there's a kind of people going in there to try and expose what's happening on the inside of those walls. Because you've got to remember, what the working classes said to each other when they came in and out of this institution were not something that was going to be picked up as part of the media. It wasn't going to go into the media what the working class thought about it. What was the way that the way that it was approached was the newspapers would be talking to the boards of guardians. And they weren't allowed in the workhouse as such, so that's why people were trying to get in there to find out what was going on. And lastly, one of the big changes is that the boards of guardians, and one area before full enfranchisement, which occurs where everybody gets the vote, is 1928. Before that, obviously women didn't have the vote, but one area that women could operate was they were able, through changes in local government, they could actually try to get elected to boards of guardians. So boards of guardians were made up of two groups really. They were ex officio magistrates. That's people who just were magistrates who automatically got on the board. They weren't elected. So in Eastville, for example, or Clifton Board of Guardians, about half the people were unelected on the board, and the other half were elected in the parishes as sort of kind of around the same thing as normal elections for Parliament. So women start getting onto the boards of guardians in the 1880s. And they affect things. A lot of them already been visitors trying to get in and see what's going on. They do improve things, certainly around treatment of the sick. So there are changes, but the real changes occur when you start to get socialists, and particularly socialist women in Eastville. For example, Jane Tillett, who was the partner with Ben Tillett, the founder of Transport and General Workers Union, she got elected onto the Barton Regis Board of Guardians in 1905, I think. And the reason that's important is there's a big difference between the socialist view of what should happen, i.e. there should be a welfare state or there should be support from the state, as against philanthropists who are kind of wealthy people who can decide whether you should get charity or not, on the basis of whether you're deserving or undeserving. So there's quite a big difference in the way people think about it. All of that affects the workhouse. More interesting though, and I've got to say, some of the really best stuff I found when I was looking, and Di found as well, was what was going on inside the workhouse. Now and then, it's very, very hard, obviously, to find out what people thought, what people were up to, and especially if it was covert activity in the workhouse. But what we do find is there's a number of incidents of vandalism, violence and riot, and they are almost exclusively led by women. So most of the cases that we've come across, and I'll just read you a couple out quickly about the kind of things that were going on in Eastville Workhouse. So this first one is just out of the newspaper from 1869. It's about a court case. Mary Ann Vaughan, a young woman, was charged with assaulting Harriet Wheeldon, the female superintendent of labour, and using threatening language towards her at the Clifton Union Workhouse. She was committed to Bristol jail for 21 days hard labour. Elizabeth Powell, another pauper, was charged with assaulting Mr Rogers, the master of Clifton Union Workhouse, and using threatening language towards him and Mrs Wheeldon. Magistrate sentenced her to 21 days imprisonment in Bristol jail. The prisoner to the master said, "I'll give thee summit when I come out, all thy beard shall be cut off." Major Castle said, "Stop a bit, young woman, we've had him mercy, we only intended to." The prisoner said, "I ain't had a fair trial, Major Castle. We have determined to," Major Castle says, "we've determined to give you 28 days instead of 21 for your insolence." Like the prisoner, she left the dock, shook her fist at Mrs Wheeldon and exclaimed, "I'll give thee summit too as well." So that's one example. And another one, you know, this is even more interesting. So these are four, again, we're talking about teenage girls here. I mean, in that case, you were talking about 12-year-olds, like. So we don't know exactly their ages, but listen to this. 4 girls named Martha Ryan, Elizabeth Davis, Elizabeth Jenkins and Mary Ann Gay, inmates of the Clifton Union Workhouse, were severally charged with riotous behaviour. Ryan and Jenkins were sentenced to 21 days hard labour and Gay and Davis to 10 days hard labour. We don't quite know what happened here, but this one we do. Eliza Sledge, Fanny Jarvis, Flora Dorr, Sarah Macy and Emma Taylor, 5 young girls, were charged under warrant with wilfully damaging 135 panes of glass worth £2 and 10 shillings, the property of the guardians of the Clifton Union at the workhouse. It appeared from the evidence of Mr D. Rogers, the master of the workhouse, that about 6:30 yesterday, Sledge, a young girl, came to him and demanded that her discharge to leave the workhouse. As her conduct had been disorderly in the former part of the week, he refused to accede to her request, telling her he intended to take her before the justices. She left the ward where this conversation took place, and in a few minutes afterwards the master heard a great noise. On going to ascertain the cause, he found all the prisoners engaged in smashing the windows with brooms and other articles, destroying not only the glass but the lead frameworks as well. They made a complete wreck of 7 windows. The noise caused by their yelling and screaming and the crashing of glass was fearful, and Mr Rogers declared he never recollected another such riot in the workhouse in his time. Mrs Nash, assistant matron, and the matron, Mrs Rogers, were called and corroborated the master's statement. Sledge, who appeared to have been the ringleader, told the bench with considerable effrontery that Mr Rogers had systematically aggravated her and driven her to what she had done. Taylor and Macy were sent to jail for a month's hard labour each, no previous conviction having been proved against them, but Sledge, Dorr and Jarvis, who had several times been convicted, were sentenced to 2 months imprisonment with hard labour. So there's a number of these cases, I won't read any more, but it is interesting that now it may be that other riots weren't reported, but certainly that these riots that involved young women were reported. There's lots of them. Another thing that was interesting was refusals to work, because there's no pensionable age in the Victorian period. You know, we kind of think 65 now. It didn't work like that in the free market economy of Victorian England. So when you went in the workhouse, you basically worked until you couldn't work anymore. And in one case, I'll read to you now. You'll see what one person thought about it all, and what he did. So, one particular case in Eastville Workhouse in 1860 clearly demonstrates the state of affairs around work and the fact you had to work. A 90-year-old inmate was brought before the Clifton Board of Guardians, complaining that the master of the workhouse had tried to force him to labour in the market gardens. After declining to work for a week, the master, seeing that the pauper's refusal to work was having a bad influence on the rest of the inmates, employed 2 men to carry him into the garden. But when taken there, he refused to do anything. So they dragged him out of the workhouse, because he'd sat there for days. "I'm not working, I'm 90, like." And they dragged him out and stuck him in the garden. He just sat there going, "I'm 90, I'm not working." The unnamed elderly man claimed that the master had declared that he would starve him and another 80-year-old inmate into obedience, despite what the guardians or anyone else thought, or words to that effect. One of the guardians objected, saying, He thought it was time an old man, as the pauper, should leave off swearing. The pauper replied, it was enough to make any man swear. The Guardians, of course, came down and supported the master of Eastville Workhouse, but suggested that perhaps he should not order 90-year-old men to work. So that protest did actually lead to a little bit of recognition that, you know, forced labour for the 90-year-olds was probably not the right thing to do. And finally, there's some other very, very tantalising things that go on. I mean, we find some cases where there's a black market going on inside the workhouse. I mean, your possessions were all taken away from you when you went in. And so people tried to trade bread and things for tobacco. There was a whole sort of black market around trying to save food. Very, very important. But also, even more interestingly, is that the workhouse officials in the Pennywell Road Workhouse, which was the one before Eastville, and then they talk about in Eastville, there seems to have been a system where people were taking food and clothing or pillowcases and all sorts of stuff, particularly food, and getting it over the wall to families outside. So that's interesting. So it's like they claim, the Guardians, that this was a system that was in operation. So there was a kind of covert, people inside the workhouse were taking food, stealing food, or saving food, and then passing it out to families on the outside, probably to stop them having to go into the workhouse. So that's very, very interesting. And then also you find people smuggling stuff in and out. So it's going over the wall at night, or people would discharge themselves in the workhouse and then throw stuff over the wall and collect it. And so there's a whole kind of stuff around that, which, I mean, it's like any prison, or, you know, you can imagine in most prisons that's all going on all the time. So it was a similar environment. So that's a bit of resistance. Right, so death.
Okay. What the period in which the burial ground was in use was from 1851, but the workhouse had opened in 1847. So where did they bury people beforehand? For a long time, we found it very difficult to find out. But then we found evidence of reports of Guardians meetings where they were complaining about the cost of transporting dead paupers back to their parish of origin. So they would be taken back to their parish of origin. That is, if they weren't taken out by their friends and buried by their friends. And the Clarion newspaper that Rogers mentioned talked about how paupers were to be buried now in dunghill, on the top of dunghills. Bearing in mind this is a period just after the cholera outbreak in Bristol, and the churchyards were full to overflowing, so they closed the churchyards to any more burials. So they really had no option but to look around locally. So they looked to this area, and as somebody said here already, they looked to the area right by the back of the workhouse, even though it was this incredibly sloping and unsuitable site. And this would save them the costs of transporting the bodies to the parishes. And they used the inmates as grave diggers and buriers and mourners. And bear in mind that the Victorians had a really big thing about funerals, with the whole kind of panoply of palaver about funerals and all the things about laying out the body, covering the mirrors with black crape and the deep mourning and so on. All of this didn't happen for paupers. They were buried in quite extreme haste, and we think it may very well be that numbers of people would be buried at one time. They would kind of save the bodies up because they had to pay the priests to conduct the burial service. One of the things that we found that was really, really strange was the reference. There's only, I think, in one or two places where they talk about an infant being buried under the wall. And we had also noted that after a while they started to give the graves numbers, and they gave there's a chronological list of numbers for adult graves and a different series of numbers for children's graves. And suddenly you're getting these infants who are below a month old who've got no grave numbers. And that is, we established, is because they weren't christened and therefore they couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. Whether or not buried under the wall meant they really were buried under the wall, or merely just at the edge of the graveyard beyond the consecrated ground. Initially there was a period of we've got maps that show it, they consecrated about a third of the area that was eventually the cemetery and began to conduct burials there, but they soon ran out of room and they had to consecrate another part, and then a third. And it cost them £50 each time they had to consecrate a piece of ground, so it was an expense they really wanted to avoid. So they then began to move where they were going back to sharing graves, and the notation on the records says buried in old ground. And what they're doing is going back to bury people on the ground that they had previously buried people. And indeed, we found they're giving the same grave numbers that they had already used. And they also complain that the graves the cemetery is being overcrowded, and they talk about burying people under the footpaths of the graves, which that's kind of supposed to be to walk on people's graves is seen as a really sort of offensive thing to do, but they were burying people under the footpaths. Then after 1895, they stop using this burial ground, and there begins to be notation in the records saying that people had been buried in Ridgeway Park. But we are also aware that paupers were also buried in Greenbank, which is just across the other side of the road. And indeed, there's a gate leading to Greenbank Cemetery opposite our Rosemary Green, which is called the Union Gate because it was opposite so we think that bodies were taken in there. But we haven't yet been able to establish that situation with the paupers buried in either Ridgeway Park.
We actually had one on Tuesday.
Prior to the Anatomy Act, the only way medical schools could have cadavers for teaching student doctors about anatomy was to use the bodies of people who'd been hanged, and there were less people being hung, was that right? And
There just wasn't enough.
there weren't enough. So then it became legitimate to give bodies to medical school. And of course that didn't cost, you didn't have to pay the cost of burial if you'd given the body to the medical school. And there's quite a lot of suggestion of boards of guardians getting money off the medical schools for far from having to pay for burying people, that they would get money off the medical schools for having given them the body. So here we see this is the actual what the death register.
Is this the workhouse death register?
Yeah.
Workhouse death register.
Yeah.
So I didn't have the luxury of looking at this document. I had to look at the microfiches for a couple of years. But eventually, when we were wanting to check the records, the record office kindly gave us photocopies of the actual, the original paper situation. And so you can see that a number of people, like on November the 7th, somebody is taken out by a friend. So they were taken away by their friends and buried elsewhere. We don't record the name, the name of that person, because we were recording the names of the unrecorded. And initially we didn't record the names of the people who had given to the medical school, because we were only interested in Rosemary Green. And then I began to wake up in the night thinking about these poor people taken to the medical school, and we haven't even recorded their names. So we went back on another 118 people who were taken by the medical school. So that's what the record looks like. And in this record, it's got a good clear one. You've got the grave number put down, so you can see where they're taken out by friends, except that there isn't a grave number. And are there any children in there?
There's a later one you can look at, but this is a medical school.
That
Sorry.
one was 18, when?
72.
1872, right. Okay.
1872, and this is we're just picking up on some medical school where it starts.
Yeah.
Medical school.
Yeah, I don't think I want to say any more about that.
No, I've done that. So Rosemary Green.
Shouldn't.
Done that? Okay.
No, it shouldn't. This is an enlarged picture of the. This is from the. This is from
This is Know Your Place website. So this is using the current ordnance survey, and I've just put a little this magnifying glass so you can. So this sort of building here. This thing here is actually the infirmary for the Eastville Workhouse. So the infirmary was actually over, so you can see kind of how it lies, the burial ground on Rosemary Green at the moment. So, I mean, it was ironic the burial ground was right opposite the infirmary. But that's kind of where we started a long time ago, when we were like, is this burial ground part of the workhouse? And obviously we proved it is now. So that's Rosemary Green, if you haven't been down there today. And if you see those two goalposts,
Yeah.
if you head just beyond there now, if you do go down to Rosemary Green, you'll find the memorial. It's in the bottom right-hand corner. But you can see it's a slope, and just under those, to the right of those goalposts, there was a river called Coombe Brook, or a stream called Coombe Brook, which runs into the River Froome, and was actually full of sewage at the time and flooded regularly. So it wasn't an ideal place to put a load of bodies who died of smallpox or cholera, typhoid, and other things. And here's another example of a record. So this is the kind of thing Di started doing. Di did the majority of the work in collecting the names. So what we were doing was, she was actually working with the microfiches, as you said, and then we would transcribe them by hand, and then they would go into spreadsheets. And if you look on our website now, if you look at the data, you'll see it's in this kind of form. So you can see here at the top there, George Theobald, he's actually on there, under the wall. You can see it, but so that's, he was, that .001 means that he actually died after 15 minutes. But he wasn't baptised, so he went under the wall. And there's a couple other interesting ones here. There's buried with mother, so they're trying to save money here. So they're burying people together. And sometimes they put children in the same grave. And, you know, that's the kind of we were working from. And so these are the final stats, really, because we need to have a chat in a minute. But at the moment, this is where we are, and it's pretty definitive, the data. The latest version was released a few days ago on our Bristol Radicals Group website, so you can go and search there, and already people have found relatives. But so it was an operation for 44 years. We've got this figure of 4,084 people were actually buried in Rosemary Green. The unknowns, because we can't read the names. And as you can see, about 25% of the people buried there were children under the age of 10, so it's a high infant mortality rate in Bristol in particular, but across the country, infant mortality didn't really improve until the welfare state of the 20th century. And we've got these 115 who didn't have grave numbers, which are probably buried somewhere on the site, but not in the graveyard, because of the baptism issue. 118, as we mentioned, went to the medical school, and as I said, the aim of the project was to name all of these people. And finally, we're going to sort of end here, because we're going to have a chat, but when I did the talk at MSHED the other week, one of the things we covered was that a lot of people, when they were talking about pauper burials, a lot of the criticisms that people said, I don't want to be buried like a dog. And that comes up a lot in the protest literature about pauper burials, because actually, prior to the Poor Law, pauper burials had some kind of there was customary practices around them. I mean, you know, people were laid out, and there was a whole process of visiting the body in the house, and you know, there would be a procession. You know, they obviously wouldn't be able to have carriages, so people would carry the body. So paupers weren't in these terrible burials. There was a kind of customary right. Well, the Poor Laws tried to sweep that away. And that's why people were really upset about things like turning dunghills into burial grounds, because by putting Rosemary Green there, that meant the whole process from start to finish of the death of a pauper was controlled by the Poor Law Union. So they were in the mortuary there, the body wasn't claimed, they went into the ground, probably in a canvas bag, with very little ceremony, no marker, and the only place that you ever find that person now is in the kind of financial record, which is the death register. So why this is important is that people say, well, they're buried. Well, actually, this is Ashton Court, and this is the grave, the pet cemetery at Ashton Court. You can see here, Saturn died on the 20th, was that born on September the 1st, 1892.
1908.
Died in 1908. So Saturn got a gravestone, as did these other dogs. And I think this is kind of poignant really in Bristol, because, you know, they weren't buried like dogs, they were buried at a lower level than dogs. So, anyway, there's some acknowledgements. And me, Steve and Di wrote the book, but without all the help of all these researchers, some of whom are from Bristol Radicals Group, some people from East Park Estate, who helped with it all, there's no way we would have been able to put the data out for public consumption. And And the day that the data went out in January earlier this year, 3,000 people downloaded it the next day. And we had numerous emails and people have not only discovered numbers of relatives, people in our own group have discovered relatives they didn't know about who are buried in Rosemary Green. And also people actually met relatives as a result nowadays through doing the family history. So it's had a huge impact, and we're quite surprised at how interested people have been and how supportive. And it's driven us on to do the project, the amount of positive support we've had. I mean, it's been, really made us want to do it, and it's part of the reason this book exists is because people really wanted it. So that's why we got to buy it.
So if my colleagues would come back round here, and you can take questions and
Can I ask
discussion. Yes.
a simple question? What records exist of the workhouse, the Clifton Union Workhouse, 16? What sort of records still exist of that? And I suppose they're in the Bristol Record Office.
The records of the admissions are in there, and they call them the creeds record because they were very interested to know what the religion was of the person going in. So they put the date they're going in and they put what religion in. And then there's the death records. Then the minutes of the Guardians' meetings, as Roger said, were lost in the bombing, but from 1860, the newspaper, the Bristol Mercury, carried very detailed reports of the Guardians' meetings, down to saying, so-and-so said she was no better than she ought to be, and then it says laughter and that sort of thing. So they're very detailed reports, and you can search them online.
So there's an omission book, there's a burial book, and then there's these
newspaper reports.
Newspaper reports.
There's also, you can also find, how we tracked a lot about the graveyards was there's all the consecration documents, all the conveyance deeds, there's maps of the workhouse as well. There's a number of different maps, so you can kind of get some idea from about 1847 to 1905 how the workhouse was changing. So there's lots and lots of maps to look at. There's quite a lot of information actually, because when we started we were told, oh, it's all gone. But actually there's quite a lot of information out there. You've just got to look in different directions. Yeah, a little bit. Well, just think, for example, all the health statistics are there, so you can go and investigate. There's a whole section on the book on, what people died of, what were the common diseases that were killing people in the workhouse. You can also find all the medical, so all that information is in the Central Reference Library. You can find all these health statistics, which as the century goes on, they get broken down into the work, so you can actually look at what's going on in Eastville Workhouse that year, what people are dying of. There's a whole load of information around that. There's also, on top of that, there's medical reports, the British Medical Journal. There's also a hand at the back. Do you mean...
children that were born in the workhouse, apart from the ones that died?
In the census, it tells you that.
So that'd be...
They don't have the books of births like they have with the deaths.
But it tells you in the census, because I know when I did statistical analysis, I could see who were paupers that were born, who had parents in the workers, who were deserters. You can see things like that in the census as well. Yeah. And there's more census data to be looked at. We've only really looked at 1881 because it was online and available. So there's more. There's actually quite a lot. We put a lot about the sources in precisely because we wanted people to follow it up and have a look. And there's more work to be done.
Can I just quickly say about if you've got a Bristol City Library card, you can go online at their website via Bristol City Council Libraries, and you can search the newspapers. Bristol Mercury, I think, had all the Guardians. So you can actually you get a web page up, you print in Border Guardians, Barton Regis, and you'll get a lot. And also it's highlighted as well, isn't it? Which is very helpful.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, you said it was demolished in the 1970s.
1972 it was.
When I wasn't clear about when the workhouse actually closed as a workhouse.
1920.
Well, it's a good question.
And also, what happened to the people that were in it when it closed? Because that's a very interesting question. Because there's these stories about people that have been put in workhouse workhouses because they were pregnant, for example, and then they were just transferred into mental hospitals. And so I don't know if you had a chance to look at that year when it was shut down, if there's any record of what happened to people.
The poor law, what happens is the poor law guardians, or the poor law boards all over the country were formed by 1834, rationalised in 1834. They stay there right into the 1930s. But what happens is that local authorities start to take over those, so local government takes over that in the 1930s. So there's a transition period. I mean, Eastville Workhouse becomes officially, I think, a part of the welfare state in 1948. And actually there's a really good source in this, which is a series of, an album of really good quality photographs of the institution showing it before the NHS improvements and after. So they've actually got that, so you can go and see that change.
1925 and 1948.
Yeah, we haven't yet. It is really,
Yeah.
and if it was become an old people, as it became an old people's home, so you're an old person, you're in there, you just stay in there. But if you were a younger person and you're
Or
in there,
an imbecile.
an imbecile, yeah.
Or there was various other categories, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's good you brought that up. Did you ever mention that thing about the scam, the scam, the lunatic scam? I mean, the 1834 Poor Law Act says that it says that you shouldn't put dangerous people who are dangerously insane or lunatics into the workhouse. It says they shouldn't be there for more than 2 weeks. But everybody in the country broke that rule. All the poor law guardians broke that rule. And they broke it for a couple of reasons, right? One is because putting paupers into asylums, which was starting to be built in the mid-Victorian period, or at least there were some around, but they were more widely being built. So in Bristol they got built in 1860, I think, or something. You get the lunatic asylum up at Stapleton, right, and next to the workhouse, actually. But what's interesting is it costs 3 times as much to put a lunatic into the asylum than it did to keep them in the workhouse. So what they did to save money, the poor law guardians, they were being pressurised, saying, look, you know, the law kind of says you shouldn't have lunatics, imbeciles and idiots in the workhouse. You shouldn't have them there. And so what they do is they say, oh, you should put them in the asylum. That's going to cost them loads of money, 3 times as much for each person. So what they do is they build a load of wards, which are just basically a load of wards. They're just the same as any other part of the workhouse, and they call them lunatic wards. And you can see them on their map earlier on. And what they do there is that they keep all their lunatics and keep them down at 1/3 of the price, you know, the workhouse price. So that whole thing was a scam, and it was a scam that was done all over the place. And what's really interesting is the arrogance of the boards of guardians, because what happens is the government realises this and realises it costs a lot more money to put people in asylums. So the government says, well, we'll give a kind of little subsidy to help you put your people with mental health problems into the asylum. And the boards of guardians in Bristol go, along with loads of others, go up the wall about the injustice to them because it's ruining their system of keeping it cheaper for themselves. So they talk about all this injustice that's being done to them by the government by giving a subsidy of, you know, and obviously there was no real facilities for looking after people with mental health problems or learning difficulties or whatever in Eastville. Yeah, it was not the right institution for those people. But anyway, it was cheap, so they kept it going.
Hello.
Yeah, no, just following on from what Graham, said, there were presumably in these workhouse asylums, did you say, loads and loads of women who'd been raped in domestic service and pregnant. But I was going to ask, did you say, Di, all the information about the ideology, where did that come from mainly, all the stuff about what you were describing, because it's so similar to now, isn't it?
Oh yes,
well, obviously, to state the obvious, you know, the way we are.
Yeah, it's the way they talk about it in the Guardian's meetings, reported in the newspapers. I mean, in fact, one of our intentions was actually to say, you know, Cameron's attack on not called paupers, but on it's completely comparable. Yeah. And indeed, some way, one of the things, when we were writing this book, I used to see a young man, I don't know if he's still there, in a doorway who spent the whole of the 2 winters sleeping rough and not eating, and saying he preferred not to eat because it made it easier And he would be less well off, actually, than some of the people would have been in the workhouse, because they used to be getting a loaf of bread and a gruel and everything. So there's ways in which this present government acts worse, if anything.
Yeah, there's a whole Malthusian philosophy behind it as well, you know, which I spoke about earlier, that the poor were going to outgrow subsistence. There's also eugenics. There was something inherently wrong with the poor. And there's a very upsetting, we were talking about the mass emigration, the forced emigration of children. In the book there's a really upsetting cartoon, for want of a better analogy, of people that are like night soul. They're cleaning the roads, because there was a lot of animals that were going around the roads, there was poo everywhere. So people used to come up at night and shovel it all up and take it out to the fields. But what it is, they're shoveling up these children. And then what they're doing is they're shoving them up to take them to Canada. And like at the back is like gin and whiskey and beer. So that's supposedly all the parents are, while the children are supposedly lying in the road. And as we said about it, they were trying to break the link between poor families and the children and send them to Canada for in their philosophy, a better life. A woman called Agnes Bevan, I think, was behind that. Yeah, and she was a particularly nasty piece of work, in my opinion.
Matt?
So you can talk about the deserving poor and undeserving poor. I just wondering if I had any idea what criteria that was judged on.
Well, the first time it really becomes part of political philosophy, I would say, is 1869, where they use those words. I mean, it was used before that, because they had words like, you know, sort of...
sturdy beggar.
Yeah, sturdy beggars and all this. But you find it in 1869, it's part of this crusade, anti-welfare crusade of the 1870s. And what's going on is that this charity organisation, so it was called the COS, Charity Organisation Society, which was basically a load of like very wealthy philanthropists, except they didn't believe in welfare, really. They believed the boards of guardians were soft and too liberal and were being duped by all these like scrounging poor people. So what their role, they were brought in by central government to kind of act as as kind of arbitrators. So they would be the ones who would investigate poor people, and then they would tell the guardians whether they should get the relief or not. And they're the ones who bring up the idea of deserving and undeserving poor, and they make it central. So they're basically a bunch of anti-welfarist free marketeers, because it was all based around who, but also were heavily into social Darwinism and eugenics, were deciding who was deserving and who was undeserving. And that's why there is so much misery in the 1870s. They really cut back on everything. So in all areas of poor relief. And it's not just a bunch of charities, it's charities with a political philosophy behind them, backed up by economists and philosophers, actually, in the 1870s. So that's where it actually comes from. They're deciding who's deserving.
Mike and then Margaret.
But they create
He's not conscious.
So you have a self-interest. They're almost terrified of, you know, a rather disturbing series of revolutions and civil revolts. So they externalise that terror of the poor into creating philosophy to try and control them and make themselves feel better. So you have this almost self-referential of providence, of creating an economic and political philosophy which justifies their own existence and allows them to kind of subdue the poor while trying to mollify their own terror of them as well.
I mean, one of the things that's, you're right, I mean, one of the things that comes up is that they do things like this. They basically start by saying no, right, and they make you beg. So I read a lot of cases, I was looking a lot about pauper funerals. Now they cut back on any money going to anybody. So people go and say, look, we want some money to bury our dad or whatever. And they just say no, and then you start begging, and they say, well, look, we'll give you a shroud. You can't have a coffin, you can have a bit of cloth. You know, it's that kind of thing. It's really detailed, a very low level. They're kind of restricting anything that's going out. And reminds me a little bit of what happened with the changes to benefits, really. It's similar. It's making it difficult for you. And you have to really work hard to get what you might deserve. And that's where it starts. But also, it's just blanket. I mean, they do things like they say, right, okay, we're going to go after certain groups. They're aware that there's lots and lots of different groups who are claiming relief. So one of the things they do is that they clamp down on payments for people as seasonal workers. They say, no, we're not going to support people who are unemployed if they're employed part of the year. So obviously, if you receive the work, it's the winner. Similarly, they start targeting groups like single parents. So if you're married and you've got children, and the person's absconded, then you're a little bit possession of somebody who's not married. They're less likely to get the benefits. So it's based on their kind of moral view of the poor, because you've got to remember that a lot of Victorian upper classes and these ideas are very strong. That like this problem is a problem of the poor. The poor is, it's Malthusian to begin with, but it becomes eugenics. It becomes the idea that the poor are genetically the way they are. Therefore, and it's nothing. They're not nasty people. They're just like, well, it's just natural that these people should probably die out or something.
I mean, no, but Mike had saying.
I was just saying, it reminds me of Athos as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
the way Athos operates, also the way that targeting under 25s with pays and benefit cuts. The way that single parents were targeted years ago, the single room rent. I mean,
disabled people.
Yeah, there's a whole range of stuff. But the question I wanted to ask was how, because I don't really understand this structure, which is that you've got this board of guardians. Is that a state institution? Is it a private company? I don't really understand how this operates at a higher level.
It's like, if you think of it as in terms of like the structure of local government, because these people are mainly elected to hold those positions, and then they employ the master and the other people that work in there. And these boards of guardians have to report eventually to the Poor Law Board that was previously the Poor Law Commissioners. So they are
in London, so centralised.
So that it's
paid for by the rates.
Paid for by the rates. That's right.
Populated by ratepayers.
Yeah.
And ironically,
as a governor, that's just your only job, not like elected council or part of that.
No.
So
It's a bit like school boards, early school boards, and it's quite ironic in some ways because it's one of the first times that women could actually get a role in local government.
Who could vote for them was anyone who could vote in Parliament. So this at this point in 1864 had to be people who owned property worth £10, men who owned property over £10, and then actually women who, if they owned property, so middle class women could also be, also be guardians.
But it's good to bring up the structure, because one of the things that's really important is to recognise that it started out, they're state institutions, elected, but they're organised by the state. But what's more important is the fact that how charities got involved in this later on. So what happens is the state institutions are being considered by certain people in government as being, these state institutions are being weak, are being duped. So they bring these charities in, which are private bodies, to kind of become to work in tandem with them. So it's like you get this intervention from outside. And actually the workhouse that was opened in Blackburn 2 weeks ago, we know about this, there's the first modern workhouse has appeared in Blackburn. So it's a bus station, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a bus station that's been converted by the local government in tandem with a charity. So it's almost identical to 1869, 1871. The Poor Law Guardians working with charities
Public-private partnership.
to organise a workhouse for homeless people to do recycling for their dole.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting development, but it is a very similar organisational structure to 1871.
Yeah. Margaret's been waiting to...
Yeah, something to say. My first job was as a generic social worker in 1972 in Leicester, and the old workhouse was used still as homeless accommodation, what was called Part 3. And one of the first families who came for help that was allocated to me lived in caravan sites in the winter because it was cheap. And then in the summer they came and asked for homeless accommodation, and they were sent to the workhouse and separated, men and women still. And yes. And the man eventually got sectioned and sent to the asylum, where he got no help at all until he broke a few windows with his fists. And the system lives on. When I looked at some of the files, one of the women who was in this family invited me to come and visit the workhouse because she said the cockroaches come out at 7 o'clock. And I didn't believe her. I went down, sure enough, and they were crawling all over the place. And when I looked through some of the files of other clients, one of them had taken a jam jar to reception social services and opened it up. It was full of cockroaches. They all flew out. When I reported this to my colleagues, thinking that they'd all be shocked and they'd agree we should all immediately phone up the local paper, they just shrugged and said, "What are you talking about? You want to get sacked?" So this was in the early 70s.
Yeah,
the very building was still there, and in the architecture of that building, you know, that mindset lived on, people still being treated like that.
We're not that far away from it. I mean, there's a really good film about labour camps in the 1930s that was set up during the Great Depression, and also there's a really interesting article about labour camps set up in the early 1970s. So there's been different. It's not that far away.
No,
I mean, Mike Payne from the GMB came to speak when we unveiled the memorial the other day, and he said something very poignant, which is that my dad was born in a workhouse, and he said, so I'm only one generation away, in Newport. It's not that far away. I mean, I always thought of it as Oliver Twist or something 1830s and 40s, but it went right on until the 1940s, arguably the Second World War. I mean, it's not that far away, and we also see signs every now and then when we go into recession that these ideas about forced labour or labour camps or this kind of thing, and these remnants are still there. I mean, and this Blackburn thing is interesting. I mean, it's like you have to keep an eye on this because it's all part of the big society. You know what I mean?
Well,
and that's what the charities.
Those kids, the kids in the family I'm talking about would now be in their 30s.
Yeah.
Of course, if Kathy come home from was separating from us, putting him in the hostel, that was run in a very similar kind of mindset to some of that one.
I mean, I could. Although we kind of keep going on about this book, Regulating the Poor by Francis Fox Piven just describes the mechanisms.
What's the book Regulating the Poor?
By Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Clower. And she describes the mechanisms that just keep on recurring. The same thing, manor house rules. And it becomes too expensive, and then there's kickback, and they do it again. It's the same.
It's like kicking off.
Yeah.